Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-priced commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we're going to be looking at the fire-happy Inquisitor, Rem Karolus, Stalwart Slayer. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to buy me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see who won last week's poll and what commanders you can vote for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Rem Karolus, Stalwart Slayer is a 2/3 human knight with flying and haste that costs 1, a red and a white with the following abilities. If a spell would deal damage to you or another permanent you control, prevent that damage. If a spell would deal damage to an opponent or permanent an opponent controls, deal that much damage +1 instead. Sporting a low curve, decent stats, and a pair of keywords that make him evasive and let him get into combat quickly, his most unique feature, by Boros standards at least, is to provide board-wide protection and amplification to damage-based spells. His first ability allows both us and our board, apart from himself, to ignore any spells that would deal damage to them, serving as not only a means to protect our board from damage-based removal and our life totals from burn effects, but also, and more importantly, makes it so that any AoE damage and burn spells we would cast ourselves ignore us entirely, turning them into one-sided swaths of destruction to devastate our opponent's boards and life totals while leaving ours unscathed. Then his second ability proceeds to make this even more potent, allowing us to amplify any damage their creatures and their life totals would take even further from not only our spells, but any damage-based spells anyone would play, providing a noticeable boost in firepower to all spell-based damage. Quite apt for an Inquisitor, it looks like Rem's specialty is raining down sacred fire on our enemies, making sure that the flames burn hotter as they consume our foes while making sure that our own forces don't get consumed by them as well. As such, the build we'll be focusing on today will be a spell damage and burn focused one, running plenty of big AoE damage spells that our commander can shield our forces and our life from, in addition to more focused forms of burn to deal more precise damage to our opponents. Both types of flames aiming to consume their creatures and their life totals like kindling. And to make sure that those flames burn extra hot, we'll be running the means to add additional damage to our spells, sources that generate additional copies for even more damage, and have ways to rekindle their embers from the grave to be used again. But we'll need to keep our commander's holy fervor in check, as his holy aura that protects against flames doesn't actually extend to himself. So we'll need to rely on other means to keep our commander alive as we rain fire on the board, preventing that damage so he isn't consumed by our own flames. So let's show our opponents that even as the sun sets on Innistrad for the final time, the flames of humanity will never go out. For Cathar, Rem Karolus, Blade of the Inquisitors, Slayer of Angels, and Eldrazi alike, we'll keep those flames alive to keep the light of humanity burning bright, and use those same flames to rain divine fire on those who seek to do it harm. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Skipping to the CMC2 slot, we have its single entry with Flame Channeler, a 2/2 that, whenever a spell we control deals damage, transforms into Embodiment of Flame. A 3/3 who, whenever a spell we control deals damage, gets a flame counter, and we can pay 1 and remove a counter to exile the top card of our deck and play it until the end of the turn, giving us a spell damage payoff that generates some cheap impulse draw that we can store up to use whenever we may need it. The CMC3 slot then starts us off with a trio of entrants with Gutter Snipe, Gadrick the Crown Scourge, and Tajik Legion's Edge. Gutter Snipe is a 2/2 that deals 2 damage to each opponent whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, taking advantage of our large arsenal of burn spells to pump out even more damage, chewing through our opponent's life totals that much quicker. Gadrick is a 5/4 flyer that cannot attack unless we control 4+ artifacts, and creates a treasure token for each creature that died this turn on our end step, providing us with a good amount of ramp as we play our big AoE damage spells to keep the board clear, while boasting a big evasive body once it comes online. Tajik is a 3/2 with Mentor that prevents all non-combat damage that would be dealt to other creatures we control, and we can pay a red and a white to grant first strike until the end of the turn, providing us with another layer of damage protection that protects our commander in addition to pumping our smaller creatures as they swing in. Then we close out this slot with Burnished Heart, a 2/2 that we can pay 3 and sack to put 2 basic lands from our deck into play tapped, serving as some staple ramp to quicken our mana curve's growth. The CMC4 slot then brings us a pair of legendary creatures with Torbrand Thane of Redfell and Torolf God of Fury. Torbrand is a 2/4 that has all our red sources that deal damage to an opponent or a permanent they control deal 2 additional damage, working nicely to supercharge our burn spells while also pumping our creatures as they deal damage as well. Torolf is an MDFC whose backface, Torolf's Hammer, is an artifact that costs 1 and a red, equips for 1 and a red, gives its wielder +3/+0 if it's legendary, and lets us pay 1 and a red, tap the equipped creature and unattach the hammer, returning it to our hand to deal 3 damage to any target, providing a decent offensive stat boost to our commander that can double as a bolt when needed. Torolf's front face is a 5/4 trampler that, whenever a creature is dealt excess non-combat damage, deals that damage to any other target, allowing us to redirect our overkill damage to our opponent's faces or any other target who may have survived the initial volley. Then we end this slot with Tectonic Giant, Stormkiln Artist, and Radiant Scroll Wielder. Tectonic Giant is a 3/4 that, whenever it attacks or becomes the target of an opponent's spell, either deals 3 damage to each opponent or exiles the top 2 cards of our deck, letting us pick one that we can play until the end of the next turn, serving as another source of AoE burn, as well as more impulse draw that lets us dig deeper into our deck for more options. Stormkiln Artist is a 2/2 that gains +1/+0 for each artifact we control, and creates a treasure whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery, giving us another source of treasure generation, this one benefiting us as we cast our burn spells and growing bigger as we amass our treasure hoard. Radiant Scroll Wielder is a 2/4 that gives all our instants and sorceries lifelink and, on our upkeep, exiles one at random from our grave that we can cast again until the end of the turn, exiling it if we do so, enabling us to get a huge amount of life from our damage-dealing spells as well as rekindling them from the grave to burn again. The CMC 5 slot then brings us some of our bigger bodies with Backdraft Hellkite, Ember Maw Hellion, and Fire Servant. Backdraft Hellkite is a 4/4 flyer that, when it attacks, gives all instants and sorceries in our grave flashback until the end of the turn, giving us yet more opportunities for us to reuse our old spells while also being a decent-sized evasive threat on its own. Ember Maw Hellion is a 4/5 trampler that has all other red sources we control deal 1 additional damage to our opponents and their permanents, adding more damage amplification to enable our burn spells to hit harder while being able to hit pretty hard itself. Fire Servant is a 4/3 that has all red instants and sorceries we control deal double damage to creatures and players, literally doubling our damage output, supercharging our burn spell so long as it remains on the field. We then close out this slot with Sir Kara the Bold, a 3/3 that, whenever it or an instant or sorcery we control deals damage to a player, exiles the top card of our deck and lets us play it until the end of the turn, while additionally letting us tap her to deal 1 damage to any target, providing yet another burn payoff in the form of card advantage, being able to proc it herself in the event we're out of burn or wish to save it. Moving on to the CMC 6 slot, we have its 2 entrants with Chandra's Incinerator and Charmbreaker Devils. Chandra's Incinerator is a 6/6 trampler that costs X less to cast, X being equal to the total amount of non-combat damage dealt to our opponents that turn, and whenever we deal non-combat damage to an opponent, deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker that player controls, giving us a huge body that quickly goes into play thanks to all our burn and turns said burn into removal for us in turn. Charmbreaker Devils is a 4/4 that, on our upkeep, returns a random instant or sorcery from our grave back to our hand and gains +4/+0 until the end of the turn whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, allowing us to get our spells back from the bin to be used over and over again while pumping itself considerably as we cast them. Finally, reaching the CMC 7 slot and our last creature, we have Velomachus Lorehold, a 5/5 flyer with Vigilance and Haste that, whenever it attacks, has us look at the top 7 cards of our deck and lets us cast an instant or sorcery from among them with CMC less than his power for free, sending the rest to the bottom of our deck in a random order, making him a big evasive body that can swing in immediately to start getting us free spells right out of the gate. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instants. Moving straight into the CMC 2 slot, we have some Boros entrants with Boros Charm, Lightning Helix, and Sacred Fire. Boros Charm has us either deal 4 damage to target player or planeswalker, has permanents we control gain indestructible until end of turn, or gives a creature double strike until end of turn, serving as a way to protect our board from wipes, both our own and our opponents, that can be used as additional damage in a pinch. Lightning Helix and Sacred Fire both deal damage to any target and heal us, the former for 3 and 3 respectively, and the latter for 2 and 2 but having flashback for 4 a red and a white, giving us some decent burn and removal that helps us pad our life totals as we use them. Some X spells then join us with Electro Dominance, Ravaging Blaze, and Aurelia's Fury. Electro Dominance deals X damage to any target and then lets us play a spell of CMC X or less from our hand for free, ignoring timing restrictions, serving as a scalable damage source that lets us drop creatures or sorceries on our opponent's turn for a good surprise factor. Ravaging Blaze deals X damage to target creature and, if we control 2+ instants or sorceries in our graveyard, deals that damage to its controller as well, letting us pick off problematic creatures and digging our opponent's life totals as we do so. Aurelia's Fury deals X damage divided amongst any number of targets, tapping down creatures' damage this way and preventing players' damage this way from casting non-creature spells until the end of the turn, adding some disruption to our damage by preventing spellcasting for a turn, stopping some turns cold unless our opponents have instant speed responses. Then more X spells are up next with Comet Storm, Fault Line, and Commune with Lava. Comet Storm can be kicked for 1 and deals X damage to any target, plus an additional target for every time it's been kicked, making it a flexible removal and burn option to deal with single or multiple targets depending on the situation. Fault Line deals X damage to all creatures without flying and each player, giving us an instant speed wipe that deals with creatures as well as our opponent's life totals, all of which our commander makes us immune to. Commune with Lava exiles the top X cards from our deck and lets us play them until the end of our next turn, providing us with a scalable source of impulse draw that gives us additional times to use those cards before they're gone for good. Then we reach the end of this slot with Price of Progress and Smash to Smithereens. Price of Progress deals damage to each player equal to twice the number of non-basic lands they control, making it capable of cutting huge swaths of our opponent's life if they run an expensive land base, all at instant speed and for only 2 mana. Smash to Smithereens destroys target artifact and deals 3 damage to its controller, giving us a decent backer removal spell that tacks on some additional burn as a bonus. Entering the CMC3 slot, we have its trio of members with Chaos Warp, Generous Gift, and Volcanic Fallout. Chaos Warp shuffles target permanent back into its owner's deck, then has its owner reveal the top card of their deck, allowing them to put it into play for free if it's a permanent, serving as a potent source of non-destruction based removal that, while risky, is able to deal with a wide variety of threats. Generous Gift destroys target permanent and gives its controller a 3/3 to replace it, providing us with another removal effect that deals with a wide variety of targets, though this one's downside is a bit less severe. Volcanic Fallout can't be countered and deals 2 damage to each creature and each player, giving us a mini wipe to keep the board clear of mana dorks, utility creatures, and small tokens that also chips away at our opponent's life totals. The CMC4 slot then brings us our last entrant with Sulphurous Blast, which deals 2 damage to each creature and each player, or 3 instead if we play it on our main phase, making it a flexible mini wipe that we can commit on our turn if we need that extra oomph. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. The CMC1 slot starts us off with some X spells with Devil's Play, Earthquake, and Rolling Earthquake. Devil's Play deals X damage to any target and can be flashed back for X and triple red, serving as a scalable source of removal and burn that we can recur for additional reach in the later game. Earthquake and Rolling Earthquake both deal X damage to all players and certain creatures, the former being limited to creatures without flying and the latter to those without horsemanship, both being more than capable of leveling everyone else's board as our commander keeps ours safe, while also taking a decent chunk out of our opponent's life totals to boot. Even more X spells join us at the top of the CMC2 slot, those being Molten Disaster, Crackle with Power, and Jaya's Immolating Inferno. Molten Disaster deals X damage to each player and each creature without flying, in addition to having Kicker for a red to give it split second, adding another damage-based wipe and burn to our arsenal that gives us the option to prevent our opponents from interacting with it just in case. Crackle with Power is a triple X spell that deals 5 times X damage to X targets, getting better and better the more mana we have to pump into it for a huge amount of burn all at once. Jaya's Immolating Inferno is the legendary spell that deals X damage to up to 3 targets, like the previous entry being able to deal lots of damage all at once to up to 3 of our opponents, but can fizzle if our commander is dealt with at instant speed, so do be aware of that. Then we end the slot with Breath of Daragaz and Flame Rift. Breath of Daragaz has Kicker for 2 and deals 1 damage to each creature without flying and each player, or 4 damage instead if it was kicked, which will usually be kicking to bring it up to be another mid-size wipe with burn attached as we have grown accustomed. Flame Rift deals 4 damage to each player, making it a no-frills burn spell that deals a decent amount of damage for its 2 CMC cost that helps further our game plan. The CMC3 slot then starts us off with a trio of mini-wipes with Steam Blast, Slag Storm, and Flame Break, the first dealing 2 damage to each creature and player, the second dealing 3 damage to all creatures or all players, and the last dealing 3 damage to all creatures and players and preventing creatures from regenerating, all 3 serving as ways to keep the board clear while further damaging our opponents. Then this slot ends with Acidic Soil and Light Up the Stage. Acidic Soil deals 1 damage to each player for each land they control, giving us a burn spell that keeps getting better and better as the game progresses and our opponent's land bases grow. Light Up the Stage exiles the top 2 cards of our deck and lets us play them until the end of our next turn, as well as having a spectacle cost of a single red, a condition we can easily fulfill thanks to our damage-focused build to get us a draw 2 effect for only a single mana. Closing in on the end now, the CMC4 slot brings us its pair of members with Ignite the Future and Fiery Confluence. Ignite the Future exiles the top 3 cards of our deck and lets us play those cards until the end of our next turn, while also having Flashback for 7 and a red, allowing us to play those exiled cards for free if we flash it back, getting us yet another impulse draw source, this one helping us cheat on cost when we recur it. Fiery Confluence has us choose 3 of the following, with each mode being able to be chosen more than once. Deal 1 damage to each creature, 2 damage to each opponent, or destroy an artifact, making it a very flexible spell that we can tailor to deal with creatures, back row, or life totals as we see fit. Finally, reaching the CMC5 slot in our last sorcery, we have Korvath's Fury, which has a select friend or foe for each player, each friend discarding their hand and redrawing that number of cards +1, while each foe takes damage equal to the number of cards they have in hand, providing some good burn on opponents with full grips and enabling us to wheel our hand away for hopefully better options if we need it. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Skipping to the CMC2 slot, we have its single entry with Mark of Asylum, which prevents all non-combat damage that would be dealt to our creatures, serving as a way to keep our commander alive through our own wipes, as well as a layer of redundancy should our commander be dealt with to continue protecting our board. The CMC3 slot then brings us a pair of entrants with Light of Sanction and Valakut Exploration. Light of Sanction prevents all damage that would be dealt to our creatures by sources we control, giving us another means to prevent our creatures from being destroyed along with our opponents due to our frequent damage-based wipes. Valakut Exploration, whenever we play a land, exiles the top card of our deck and allows us to play it until the end of the turn, sending any card exiled with it back to the grave on our end step if not played, and dealing a damage for each to each opponent, providing us an additional source of continual impulse draw as we make our land drops that also contributes to the burn plan if we don't need the cards. The CMC 4 slot then gives us another pair of impulse draw sources with Outpost Siege and Showdown of the Scalds. Outpost Siege has us choose Cons or Dragons when it ETBs, Cons having us exile a top card of our deck and allowing us to play it until the end of the turn, while Dragons deals 1 damage to any target when a creature we control leaves the battlefield, which will be primarily running for the impulse draw but can be used for burn if we need some additional reach. Showdown of the Scalds is a saga whose first chapter exiles the top 4 cards of our deck and lets us play them until the end of our next turn, and whose second and third chapters let us put a +1/+1 counter on target creature whenever we cast a spell, providing us a hefty amount of impulse draw initially and later grows our commander or other creatures as we cast our burn for even more damage. Finally, reaching the CMC 5 slot, we have our last enchantment with Double Vision, which allows us to copy the first instant or sorcery we cast each turn, doubling up our burn and being particularly good with X spells to get even more value out of them the more mana we pump into them. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Some ramp options start us off in the CMC 1 slot with Sol Ring and Wayfarer's Bauble. Sol Ring taps for 2 colorless, which we run because we're in Boros and it provides the best ramp we can ask for outside any color combination with green in it. Second up is Wayfarer's Bauble, which lets us pay 2, tap it and sack it to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, giving us an early land ramp source that helps us sort out our mana base as well. Then some mana rocks start off the CMC 2 slot with Arcane Signet, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Boros Signet, which we can pay 1 and tap to generate both our colors, Talisman of Conviction, which we can tap for a colorless or either of our colors if we take a damage, and Mind Stone, which taps for a colorless and we can pay 1, tap it and sack it to draw a card. Then we close out this slot with Sunforger, an equipment that equips for 3, gives the equipped creature +4/+0, and lets us pay a red, a white, and unattach it to search our deck for a CMC 4 or less instant and play it for free, providing a decent offensive stat boost and a means to tutor up some additional burn or protection as needed. The CMC 3 slot then brings us Magebane Armor, another equipment which equips for 2, grants the equipped creature +2/+4, has it lose flying, and prevents it from taking any non-combat damage, giving us another means to keep our commander alive through our own wipes, and while it does take away evasion, the stat boost that it gives goes some way to make up for this. Skipping to the CMC 5 slot, we have our last artifact with Pyromancer's Goggles, which taps for a red, and if the mana is used to pay for a red instant or sorcery, it copies that spell, serving as another means to double up on our spells while generating mana to help us cast them. That covers all our artifacts, so let's move on to our Planeswalkers. Our only Planeswalker joins us in the CMC 5 slot, that being Jaya Ballard, who comes into play with 5 loyalty and has the following abilities. Her +1 generates triple red that we can only spend on instants and sorceries. Her other +1 lets us discard up to 3 cards, then draw that many. And finally, her -8 gives us an emblem that effectively gives all our instants and sorceries flashback, providing us with quite a bit of utility as a ramp source for some of our more mana-hungry spells, a card selection source to help us dig for more burn, and finally an ultimate that lets us recur all our spells back for an insane amount of value if we can reach it. That covers all our Planeswalkers, so let's move on to our land base. Starting with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Battlefield Forge, which taps for a colorless or either of our colors if we take a damage, Fury Calm Snarl, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal a plains or mountain and taps for either of our colors, Boros Garrison, which comes into play tapped, bounces a land back to our hand when it ETBs and taps for both our colors, Temple of Triumph, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and scries 1 when it ETBs, Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless, and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to put 2 basic lands of the same type from our deck into play tapped, and finally Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped. Then for our utility lands, we'll be running Ghost Quarter and Scavenger Grounds. Ghost Quarter taps for a colorless, and we can tap it and sack it to destroy target land, letting its owner replace it with a basic from their deck, giving us some good spot removal to deal with our opponent's utility lands. Scavenger Grounds also taps for a colorless, and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to exile all cards from all graveyards, giving us an option to deal with graveyard-focused builds that we'll want to be careful with to not impact our own graveyard recursion. Lastly, we're running 9 plains and 16 mountains as our basics to fill out our land base. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 18 creatures including the Commander, 15 instants, 16 sorceries, 6 enchantments, 9 artifacts, 1 Planeswalker, and 35 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 31 sources of burn, 26 sources of spell-based burn, 8 cards that care about instants and sorceries, 4 sources of damage amplification, 2 sources of spell copying, and 6 sources of non-combat damage protection, ensuring that we have plenty of spell and non-spell burn effects to fling at our opponent's life totals, payoffs for our burn sources for additional value, as well as ways to amplify their damage, recur them from the grave, and even copy their effects, all while having multiple means of protecting ourselves and our creatures from the fallout. For general deck stats, we have 12 ramp sources, 9 card draw sources, 16 targeted removal sources, and 11 board wipes. Both our removal and wipes being at higher than normal ratios since they're tied to our burn effects, while our ramp and draw remain at standard numbers. Looking at our mana curve, we have 5 1-drops, 22 2-drops, 17 3-drops, 10 4-drops, 8 5-drops, 2 6-drops, and 1 7-drop. Appearing to be an aggressive curve, but in reality skewing to be more of a mid-game one as many of our 2 and 3 drops are X-spells, but still allowing us to get our mana sources out early, quickly establish our commander, then proceed to scorch the board and our opponent's life totals. Currently, this deck is valued at $64.77, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, some damage-dealing spells that don't hit life totals could also find a home here. Deafening Clarion, Magma Quake, and Blasphemous Act all serve as additional ways to keep the board clear of creatures so ours have a clear shot at our opponent's faces. Some Boros payoffs, like Firesong and Sunspeaker as well as Blazing Commando, would also be good, giving us some additional value as we cast our spells in the form of life gain and tokens respectively. For upgrades, Gisela Blade of Goldlight, Fiendish Duo, and Fiery Emancipation all help amplify our damage considerably to burn out our opponents even faster. Neheb the Eternal grants us a huge amount of ramp as we deal damage to our opponents while being able to deal damage itself through Afflict, while our Roas God of Victory protects our board even further from our own damage-based wipes. Finally, we can run Smothering Tithe and Darkside Extortionist to provide us a huge amount of ramp to fuel our burn spells, but we'll need to burn a whole lot of cash ourselves to fuel their price. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Looking at the results of last week's poll, it looks like Eloise Nephalia Sleuth was able to claim the top spot, so look forward to solving Innistrad mysteries with her next week. Moving on to this week's poll, let's bring the options down to 2 for an angelic showdown, with this week's contenders being Laisa Forgotten Archangel and Sigarda Champion of Light. Please cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments which angel you sided with and which commanders from Midnight Hunt you'd like to see in a future poll. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel cannot grow without your support. And if you really like my content, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to help keep me caffeinated. Also, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the cut rate commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.